Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The hills of Samaria in the 8th century BCE were quiet green in the spring, parched in summer, and dotted with stone villages whose names have faded from time. It was a land of wheat and goats, of rough altars and older memories, and it stood at the crossroads of empires. But one city rose higher than the rest, Samaria itself, built by King Omri. It was not just the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, it was a symbol, defiance against Jerusalem, a place with its own temple, its own priests, its own scrolls. And though history rarely mentions its own treasure, it is that treasure we begin with, not the gold of Solomon's temple long mythologized in the south, but the quieter, provincial wealth of a kingdom that stood for 2 centuries before vanishing. What happened to it is a question lost in the margins of conquest. But let's begin before the end, when Samaria still stood, and when the treasure of the 10 tribes still lay hidden in plain sight. The city on the hill Samaria was no ordinary city. Archaeological excavations at Tel Sebastopol, the ancient site of Samaria Rivia, a surprisingly sophisticated settlement. Stone walls, palatial structures, olive presses, and even imported ivory carvings. The Book of Kings speaks of houses adorned with ivory, and though many dismiss that as poetic flourish, dozens of ivory fragments beautifully carved in Phoenician style have been unearthed among the ruins. There was wealth here, but not the kind measured only in coin. Grain was stored in deep silos, oil in clay jars, sealed with linen. There were trade goods from Tyre and Sidon, and alabaster vessels, likely imported from Egypt. But most important were the sacred items, ceremonial bowls, polished horns, silver bands used in priestly rites, and written records, perhaps the oldest in Israel's north. And then there was the gold. We don't know exactly how much. The Bible, in its sparse mentions, suggests tribute was often paid in silver, but gold was present in jewelry, in ceremonial items, and possibly in the ornamentation of the northern temple itself. That temple, unlike its southern counterpart in Jerusalem, has been almost entirely erased. It had no Ark of the Covenant, numbered Davidic lineage to protect it, no central priesthood with written histories to preserve its story, but it had altars, priests, and treasure, the split of the kingdom too. Understand why Samaria held such wealth. We must recall the division that came after Solomon. After the great king's death, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne, but his rule was heavy-handed. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, those in the north, rebelled, breaking away to form a separate kingdom under Jeroboam. Jerusalem remained the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah, but the north, larger and richer in land, became the kingdom of Israel with Samaria as its center. Jeroboam, fearing that his people might return to Jerusalem for worship and thus pledge loyalty to the southern king, established 2 centers of worship, one at Bethel, the other at Dan. He also built altars, possibly even a temple in Samaria itself. He appointed priests from outside the Levitical line, and he likely transferred sacred objects, copies of scrolls, ritual tools, and wealth away from Jerusalem and into his new sanctuaries. These acts, condemned by later biblical writers, were strategic, and they may have seeded Samaria's quiet accumulation of sacred wealth: gold, silver, copper, and written tradition hidden in its own temple in the houses of its nobility. But this wealth, as with all things in history, would not remain untouched. The Assyrian shadow by the mid-8th century BCE, the kingdom of Israel stood in a precarious position, though rich in agriculture and trade. It was trapped between rising powers. To the northeast loomed Assyria, brutal, expansionist, and methodical. To the south, Judah watched carefully, both rival and brother. King Hoshea, the last king of Israel, tried to play both sides, paying tribute to Assyria while courting Egyptian support in secret. It was a miscalculation. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser laid siege to Samaria. The city held out for 3 years. It was a slow death, not fire and sword, but starvation, fear, and betrayal. And in that time, those final months and weeks, one must ask, what happened to the treasure? The gold, the scrolls, the sacred vessels? Were they carried away, hidden beneath the city, stolen by those fleeing, or quietly absorbed into the machinery of empire? The records fall silent, but a few clues remain. The inventory that never came when Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon in 586 BCE. A century later, we are given detailed lists of what was taken: gold bowls, silver pans, bronze censers, sacred trumpets, even door hinges from the temple. But Samaria's, far earlier, quieter, is given no such inventory. Why? Possibly because the northern temple was already considered illegitimate by southern scribes, or because the Assyrians, unlike the Babylonians, had little interest in documenting such things for the record of the Israelites. But more likely, it's because much of the treasure never made it into imperial hands. The Assyrians were efficient. They took captives. They raised walls. They planted foreign settlers to erase identity, but they weren't always thorough. And the people of Samaria knew the land better than any invading army. Caves, ravines, old altars in the hills, places where silver could be buried, scrolls sealed in jars, gold ornaments broken and hidden in bread ovens, or buried beneath olive presses. And it is in these hills, archaeologists believe, that traces of the 10 tribes. Wealth may have lingered long after the kingdom was gone. The priests who stayed silent after the fall. Assyria deported much of Israel's population, but not all. Many villagers were left behind: farmers, craftsmen, and priests who blended into the new populations brought in by the empire. Over time, these people became what history calls the Samaritans, community similar to the Jews but with distinct traditions, scrolls, and beliefs. To this day, the Samaritans claim descent from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. They still worship on Mount Gerizim, their sacred mountain. They preserve an ancient version of the Pentateuch written in a different script, with subtle but telling variations, and some among them still whisper that their ancestors once guarded treasure, not in the form of gold coins or royal crowns, but sacred vessels, written laws, priestly tools passed down from the sanctuary of Samaria. If this is true, then the wealth of the 10 tribes may never have been lost, only dispersed, hidden, not in a tomb or temple, but in memory, in oral tradition, in homes where priests once whispered prayers no longer heard in Jerusalem. A golden earring in the dust, 1949. A small gold earring was discovered in the ruins near ancient Samaria. It was simple, crescent-shaped, likely worn by a woman of means. It was not part of a hoard. No coins surrounded it. No box, no seal, just one earring, alone in the dust. Perhaps it had fallen during flight, or been dropped by a looter, left behind by someone who never returned. Its style matched Phoenician designs. Its gold was pure. It told no story, but it hinted at one. A story of wealth not cataloged, but lived, carried, hidden, lost in the folds of time. And that is where we pause, because Samaria did not fall all at once. Its treasure did not vanish in a single fire, and the gold of the 10 tribes, if it ever existed in the way we imagine, may still lie buried, not far from where the olive trees grow, not in legend, not in myth, but in storage jars beneath the earth, waiting for someone to remember. By the time the Assyrians finally breached the walls of Samaria, The kingdom had already been bleeding. 3 years of siege had drained its granaries, its strength, and its silence. The city, once bustling with temple bells and bartering voices, fell into a hush, broken only by the ordered steps of soldiers and the occasional cry of someone discovering their home now belongs to someone else. But the story of Samaria does not end with conquest. It continues, slowly, with dust-covered roads that led out of the city northward and eastward toward the heart of an empire, and with people walking, shackled, exiled, people who carried nothing but the memory of their homeland, and perhaps knowledge of where its treasures had gone. The Assyrians did not destroy everything. That was not their way. They took what could be used, what could be moved, what could be made Assyrian, and they were systematic in how they did it. The deportation strategy Glyth Pilser 3. An Assyrian king before the fall of Samaria developed a chillingly effective system. Conquer, deport, and replace. Entire populations were moved often hundreds of miles to prevent rebellion and erase local identities. This policy was not random cruelty. It was administrative control. So, when Samaria finally fell under Shalmaneser V and later Sargon II, its inhabitants were not all slaughtered. They were relocated. Assyrian records, preserved in cuneiform on clay tablets, speak plainly of these actions. One inscription states, "I carried off 27,290 people from Samaria. I resettled them in the cities of the Medes." These cities were far away near modern-day Iran. Dry lands, unfamiliar gods, foreign tongues. The journey itself could take months, often on foot. Caravans moved slowly, guarded by soldiers, with captives, men, women, children walking behind carts. And here is where the trail of treasure gets cold. If there was gold taken from Samaria temple implements, household wealth, priestly relics, then some of it may have moved along these routes. But was it ever cataloged? Was it ever seen again? The hidden carts Assyrian practice did not always treat captives as slaves. Many were resettled as farmers, artisans, or even civil servants. But elites, nobles, priests, and scribes were often taken under tighter control. And elites do not travel empty-handed. Imagine this: a line of carts. 2 soldiers walk alongside each. Children sit, heads down. A priest sits hunched over, silent. Beneath sacks of grain or clay pots, something else is hidden. A scroll wrapped in linen, a polished horn, silver ring carved with a family seal, a small sealed jar that clinks when moved. The Assyrians were brutal, but not omniscient. We know from later Babylonian records that captured peoples often smuggled sacred objects with them. The Ark of Nabu was said to have been taken from a temple in Haran and hidden during exile. Sacred scrolls reappear in later centuries in unexpected places. Alexandria, Elephantine, Qumran. Could some of Samaria's treasure have been smuggled out this way? Not in great caravans of gold, but in private, painful, quiet efforts to preserve what mattered. The cities of exiles, the Assyrians, resettled Israelites in a region referred to as Hala, Kana, and Gozan on the Helm's Age of the Medes. Today, these places are remote. Few tourists visit them. Their names have shifted, buried under modern borders and ruined tales. But excavations in the ancient Assyrian provinces of Guzana, modern-day Tel, Halaf, Arbela, now Erbil, and even Ekbatana, modern Hamadan, in Iran, have uncovered surprising traces. In Tel Halaf, archaeologists found burial sites with grave goods bronze, small beads, fragments of Hebrew-style pottery dating to the 8th century BCE in northern Iran. Jewish communities persisted well into the medieval period, many claiming descent from the 10 tribes. One community in Hamadan guarded a tomb they believed belonged to Esther and Mordecai. Another preserved traditions of a temple once buried beneath their synagogue. It is possible, some scholars believe, that Sumerian exiles maintained priestly traditions in these far-off lands, and that with them they kept objects too sacred to discard. The gold may have been melted, traded, lost, but the knowledge of the scrolls, the words, may have survived. A scroll with no ending in 1952. In the caves of Qumran, near the Dead Sea, fragments of ancient Hebrew texts were uncovered. Among them was one strange scroll, the copper scroll. Unlike the others, this was not made of parchment. It was inscribed onto thin sheets of copper, rolled tightly, and hidden in a cave. And unlike the spiritual texts around it, this scroll was a list of buried treasure. 64 locations, bars of gold, silver vessels, temple items, tombs, aqueducts. No one knows who wrote it. Some date it to the time of the Second Temple. Others believe it could preserve older traditions, echoes of treasures hidden before or during the first exile. The language of the copper scroll is strange, lacking the spiritual tone of the others. Some researchers believe it may draw from northern traditions, the way it counts, the phrases it uses, the geographies it describes. Could this have been based on oral memories passed down from the Sumerian priests? Could it list not the treasure of Jerusalem, but of Samaria? Most scholars say no, but none can explain where the copper scroll came from, more why it alone was engraved on metal, not skin. Memory as currency over centuries. Physical treasure fades, but memory moves. The Samaritans who remained in the land kept their own version of the Torah. It differs subtly from the Jewish version in names, in measurements, in emphasis, and it includes accounts of Joseph's bones carried from Egypt and buried at Shechem, of priests who guarded sacred stones, of sacrifices performed on Mount Gerizim, not Mount Moriah. They preserve stories of scrolls saved from burning, of gold bowls passed from father to son, of a fire that once burned in a sanctuary now lost to time. None of these are recorded in Syrian tablets, but perhaps they were never meant to be a final journey. There are hints, just hints, till some Sumerians, after exile, made their way not east, but south. Legends speak of Israelites who fled before the siege, traveling to Egypt, to Arabia, and beyond. A 9th century manuscript mentions a group of northern priests who brought sacred items to Elephantine, an island in the Nile. There, a Jewish temple, once studio, excavated and dated to the 5th century BCE. It contained altars, burnt offerings, and sacred vessels. Could the gold have ended there? Could pieces of Samaria's temple have lived on in a different form, rebuilt, far from home? We may never know, but every jar fragment, every pierced silver earring, every faint inscription carved on limestone speak, not clearly, but with a whisper of wealth once moved in silence, a priest who remembered, cities that fell, and people who did not forget. They say that when an empire falls, its treasures are either taken by the victors, or by the silent hands of those who do not wish them found. And in the months leading up to Samaria's final surrender, the city's priests and record keepers quiet. Men in simple robes may have done what history no longer remembers. They buried what could not be carried. We do not know their names. Not even their titles have survived intact. But traces of their thinking remain, not in gold or silver, but in the way ancient Israelite rituals vanished, shifted, or reappeared elsewhere. It is often in the disappearance of something, rather than its survival, that its value is revealed. The temple in Samaria was not like Jerusalem's. It had its own lineage, its own rules, its own vessels and rites, and perhaps its own sacred economy, measured in more than coins, the silver that wasn't recorded in the ruins of Samaria. Archaeologists found storehouses, long, narrow rooms beneath public buildings, with rows of clay jars, some smashed, some sealed, and mixed in the dust were fragments of silver ingots, not coins, not jewelry, but raw silver, cast into bars, cut roughly into standardized shapes, weights for trade, for tribute, for offerings. In ancient Israel, silver was rarely minted. It was weighed. A shekel wasn't a coinage, was a unit of weight. So when the priests handled silver, they handled it like grain, measured, stored, portioned. This is important because silver in this form was rarely taxed. It didn't pass through official Assyrian hands like coinage did. It was used privately, locally, religiously. It wasn't always recorded, so when the Assyrians advanced and it became clear that the siege would not lift, the priests of Samaria likely did what many in the ancient world did in the face of collapse. They hid what mattered. They may have divided the temple stores into smaller hoards, sent trusted families into the countryside, dug beneath olive presses, beneath floors of granaries, marked the locations with verses or stones or nothing at all. And they did not tell anyone, because to tell was to risk losing not just the silver, but the memory. Hidden in the hills north of Samaria, the land folds into soft hills, dry, crumbling cliffs, pockets of scrub trees, and caves. Many, many caves. Shepherds still use them. So did bandits, and in the 20th century, a few curious scholars too. In 1932, a series of small exploratory digs revealed pottery from the Iron Age hidden deep in these limestone folds. One cave never officially documented was said to contain burnt bones, broken jars, and a set of bronze weights that bore no Assyrian markings. Some scholars believe they were used for trade, quote, by Sumerian refugees. Others believe they marked where something had been taken or buried. We may never know. The cave collapsed before a full excavation could be completed. But across northern Israel, small caches of silver 2 shekels here, 5 shekels there have been unearthed by accident, always rural, always hidden, never accompanied by inscriptions or context, almost as if the memory was intentionally erased. A pattern lost in silence. This is not unique to Samaria. Throughout the Near East, temple treasuries were occasionally removed just before disaster, in Babylon, in Nineveh, in Memphis. But those removals were often recorded proudly, even by the victors. What's different in Samaria is the absence of any account. The Assyrians do not boast of looting its temple. No great inventory is carved onto stone. No golden bulls or silver basins are paraded through capital cities. Instead, the records say simply, the city was taken, the king was deposed, the people were deported. The silence is louder than a claim, and it raises a quiet possibility that perhaps, time the Assyrians reached the temple vaults, they were already empty, that the silver had already disappeared piece by percent in the hands of those who knew how to walk slowly, how to wait in silence, how to keep secrets. The ritual of vanishing in some ancient traditions. The act of hiding sacred items was itself considered a ritual in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are cryptic references to the sons of Zadok, a priestly line who prepared sacred vessels for the time of hiding. There's a mention of a teacher of righteousness who instructed his followers to preserve certain texts in clay jars. During periods of foreign domination, these references are often tied to Qumran or Jerusalem, but the idea itself of hiding something, not for safety, but for remembrances, older. We find echoes of it in Egyptian tombs, where Shabti figurines were buried to serve the dead in the afterlife, in Mesopotamian libraries, where tablets were buried beneath floors in case of fire or conquest, and in the Israelite tradition in the Ark of the Covenant itself, kept hidden behind a veil, touched only once a year by one man. Hiding was a sacred act, a way of waiting, a way of trusting time. So when the priests of Samaria decided to bury their silver, They were not just avoiding theft. They were preserving a pattern, a memory, a silence. One they believed would outlast the empire that stood above it. The road to nowhere. The roads leading out of Samaria eventually led to nowhere. Many of the routes the Assyrians used for deportation no longer exist. Towns like Hala and Gazan are buried, renamed, or ruined. And the people who once walked those roads have vanished into genealogies, legends, and forgotten stones. But in the hills outside Nablus-Sunchin, Shechem, there remains a Samaritan community. Small, quiet, almost invisible in modern history. They still worship on Mount Gerizim, still keep the old calendar, still read a version of the Torah that many scholars believe preserves pre-exilic traditions, and in their prayers are faint allusions to temples, two vessels, two guardians who once hid things to protect the sacred. When asked where these treasures went, they do not answer directly, but they do not deny their existence either. In 1997, a researcher visited a Samaritan elder who pointed to an ancient olive tree and said, simply, "That hill once had something that was never meant to be found again." And then he said nothing more. The last silver cup. In 2003, a silver cup was found in a private collection in Jerusalem. It bore no modern hallmark, no Roman design, only a faint inscription. 3 letters in Paleo-Hebrew, barely legible. Tests confirmed its age 8th century BCE. It had no known origin. The seller claimed it came from a hill near Sebastia, the ancient site of Samaria. But no dig had been reported. The cup was small, simple, not valuable in a modern sense, but its shape matched descriptions found in Levitical texts, so vessels used in priestly blessing. It now sits in a vault, unclaimed by any museum. The silver is real. Its journey is not. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was one of the last things touched by a priest who chose silence over surrender. The burial that had no archahistory favors what is recorded, what is named, what is weighed and signed. But beneath the surface of many fallen cities lies another kind of memory. One that does not speak. One that hides itself in layers of earth, waiting not to be discovered, but to be forgotten in the right way. The priests of Samaria did not save their people. The city fell. The temple was stripped. The kingdom vanished. But they may have saved something else. Its fragment of silver, a sealed scroll, a memory of a rhythm of worship, of law, of silence. And in doing so, they became part of a different kind of history. One that cannot be dated by conquest or crowned by kings. One that still whispers from beneath unmarked stones in the hills of a land that no longer remembers its own name. They didn't leave by choice when the northern kingdom of Israel collapsed. The Assyrian king Shalmaneser V ordered a methodical, almost mechanical removal of people. Not just warriors, not just the elite, but entire families, craftsmen, herdsmen, scribes, widows, temple workers, children too small to walk the journey. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't punishment. It was policy. Assyria's empire had grown immense, and with size came risk. Rebellion could spring up in any corner. To prevent this, Assyrian rulers perfected the practice of forced resettlement. Uproot a people, scatter them across unfamiliar lands, dilute their memory, and they would not rise again. The Israelites were one of many peoples to suffer this fate, and yet their memory did not vanish. The Book of Kings, written long after, records it simply. So the king of Assyria carried Israel away, placed them in Hala and in Habor by the river of Gazan, and in the cities of the Medes. No date, number, names of those taken, no account of what they carried. But if we listen quietly and look closely at the old roads east, we may begin to trace the silent line of captives and the quiet disappearance of their treasure. The roads beneath the dust today. There is no direct path between Samaria and the cities of Gozan and Hala. Borders have shifted. Nations have risen and fallen. But if you lay a map over a satellite image, a subtle line appears where desert meets highland, and where ancient waypoints still echo in local place names. The captives would have been marched east through the Jezreel Valley, past Megiddo, then north through Bashan, Tyre, under the heat of a low sky. They would have passed grazing lands now long turned to dust. Assyrian records describe rest camps spaced every 2 to 3 days, walk small enclosures where guards could count heads and supplies could be replenished. The journey may have taken 2 or 3 months. No carts, no wagons. The people walked. They carried what they could on their backs or shoulders woven bags. Clay vessels sealed with pitch, leather rolls containing linen, maybe even thin sheaves of pressed silver. Some may have buried items along the way, hoping to return. Others may have traded their last jewelry for water at Assyrian outposts. And some, the ones with nothing left to lose, may have simply walked until their legs failed. There are no songs about this, no stone monuments, no shrines beside the road. Only the slow forgetting of movement. What is Hala? We don't know. The city called Hala appears only once in the Hebrew Bible, in connection to this exile. For a long time, scholars assumed it was a corruption of Kala, an Assyrian city near modern-day Nimrod. Others argued it was near the Kabar River in what is now northeastern Syria. But Hala has no excavated remains, no known temple, no shrine, no visible marker, which is, perhaps, the point. The Assyrians chose places for resettlement that were isolated, fertile enough to work, far enough to forget. They did not intend for the Israelites to rebuild a kingdom. They were meant to become part of the landscape. And yet across this barren geography, small clues remain in the 1950s near the town of Tel Halaf. German archaeologists found inscriptions in Aramaic referring to a group called the Gamir. Later inscriptions listed a related tribe, the Jamiri, Qum, some link to the exiled Israelites. More curiously, several Assyrian tablets from the era mention temple workers arriving from the house of Omri, the Assyrian term for Israel 11 decades after Samaria fell. They weren't prisoners anymore. They were functionaries, and possibly carriers of memory. Gozan and the Ghost River, the Kaba River, no longer flows as it once did. Its tributaries run shallow now, stunted by drought and rerouted irrigation. But in the 8th century BCE, it was the artery of a semi-urban corridor cities that rose and fell in the shadow of bigger capitals. Gozan was one of them. Excavated briefly in the early 20th century, Gozan revealed no palaces, no great temples, but its residential zones, modest homes, storage pits, household shrines suggested a community that rebuilt quickly. Pottery found there included both Assyrian forms and earlier West Semitic designs. More notably, clay cylinder, uncovered in the ruins, referred to a local merchant guild welcoming settlers from the west. The line is faint, unproven, but scholars believe it refers to exiles from Samaria. And if so, what did they bring? Not much, but possibly the memory of silver. Silver in the markets. The Assyrian economy thrived on silver. Not mined locally, but extracted from tribute, especially from regions like Israel. It's possible, then, that some of the silver taken or hidden in Samaria made its way east. But here's the strange part. Syrian silver weights shift slightly in the years following the Israelite exile. Previously, the mina and shekel standards were strictly enforced, standardized across regions. After the deportations, a new set of local weights appears in the eastern provinces, slightly lighter, not Assyrian, and yet widely used. Some theorize that these were Israelite measures brought east and adopted locally. If true, it means something of Israel's economy survived, not just in memory, but in practice. Not the gold of kings, but the weight of bread, of oil, of wages, a different kind of treasure. The language that stayed behind the Israelites brought more than goods. They brought language in Hala and Gozan. Aramaic inscriptions from the 7th century show subtle shifts in syntax and spelling consonants. Dropped, vowels reversed, loan words from Hebrew entering the local dialect. One word stands out, kesef, silver, used not just for the metal itself, but for value, for price, for honor, in a receipt fragment found in the ruins near the Kaaba. Key, a man named Pakadel agrees to pay 5 ksf for a bundle of dyed cloth. The name is Semitic, the word is Hebrew, and the cloth, it came from Phoenicia, the Mediterranean coast, which suggests trade routes remained, and with them, taps, a quiet current of displaced wealth silver, once stored in Samaria, now spent in the shade of foreign trees. The silence between. The record's history does not tell us who carried the last silver ingot out of Samaria. We do not know whether it was hidden in a child's blanket, sewn into a sandal strap, or exchanged for lentils outside a dusty town. But we do know that the Israelites did not vanish. They appear again in fragments, not as a nation, but as names, on tablets and contracts, engraved markers written in Aramaic, bearing names like Zechariah, Hadassah, and Baruch, some inscribed with symbols we don't recognize, perhaps tribal signs, perhaps nothing, but always silent, always watching, always remembering what was carried. Note what was left when a people are scattered. Some things survive in plain sight, language, measurements, memories, embedded in lullabies or prayers, but other things heavier, more precious must be left behind. We do not know if the Israelites buried gold along the road east. We do not know if their scrolls were burned or saved or copied in secret, but we know this: by the time the Assyrians broke the last defenses of Samaria, its people had already learned how to lose quietly, and in that silence, something remained, not in vaults, not in temples, but in the way their children counted silver, in the rhythm of contracts, in the quiet resistance of naming a child something holy. Even in a foreign land, they carried memory, and sometimes that is the longest journey of all. When the Israelites were taken east, they carried more than goods. They carried memory, songs without accompaniment, scrolls written by trembling hands, and perhaps, just perhaps, a few remnants of the sacred itself. But here, far from the stones of Samaria, those sacred items faded, not in flame, not in destruction, but in stillness, in waiting. Because there was one place even empires did not watch. The dust beneath abandoned temples, the temple that Wazano record tells us that the Israelites built a temple in exile. There was no second Mount Gerizim, no copy of the Golden Ark, no great altar in Hala or Gozan, and yet the shape of worship, the memory of sacrifice, the cadence of priestly chants, continued. How? Some scholars believe that Israelites once settled, repurposed small shrines that had been left behind by previous Assyrian conquests. These were not grand places, were mud brick rooms, often partially collapsed, their former idols broken or carted away. But to a people in exile, a corner of the sacred could be made anywhere in the ruins of Dur-Katlamu, not far from the Kaaba River. Archaeologists found what they believed to be a minor temple complex abandoned centuries before the Israelite arrival. But in one of the rooms, thing covered strange inscriptions carved into the plaster, not in cuneiform, but in an early Semitic script. Several words stood out: Torah, Shalom, Levi. No full sentences, just fragments, a name, a word of peace, and a reference to law. And there, buried beneath the floor, a small jar with a lid inside. No treasure, traces of papyrus dust. It had been a scroll once, and it had been hidden. Why hide a scroll? Papyrus does not last long underground, but the presence of decayed papyrus and the sealed jar suggests an intention. Someone preserved it, hid it. K protected it. This was not a library. It was a grave. And the question historians have long asked is, why bury a scroll? One answer: the words were holy, too holy to be destroyed, too dangerous to be seen. In Jewish tradition, sacred texts that are damaged or unreadable are not burned or thrown away. They are buried in a Geniza kind of memory tomb for paper. This tradition is later, yes, but could it have roots in exile? Some think so, and if that's true, then perhaps the scroll buried beneath the dust wasn't the only one. Perhaps other sacred writings, fragments of the old law, or even descriptions of Israel's lost treasures were hidden beneath shrines, under the roots of fig trees, or in dry caves between hills. And if so, are they still there? There? The role of the Levites? Levites were the priestly class, not always high priests, but assistants, guardians of ritual, caretakers of the sacred. When the northern kingdom fell, Levites scattered. Some fled to Judah, to the southern kingdom, but others stayed with their people, even in exile. The Syrian records mention a group known as the Men of El, assigned to oversee grain storage near the city of Arapha, modern Kirkuk. Some scholars believe these were Levites, given administrative roles because of their literacy, and in those dry storehouses filled with barley, lentils, and straw, perhaps other things were stored: parchment, scrolls, weights, and measures etched with Hebrew markings. One Assyrian tablet lists a Yahu Barnasi, who was given control of temple accounts in the district of Guzano. His name means Yahweh is my son of the prince, a religious name, not a name you give up easily if he lived, and if he prayed. Then maybe he remembered the temple in Jerusalem, or the altar at Bethelor, the ark he had only heard about in song, and maybe, quietly, he wrote those songs down, not to spread, not to share, but to hide. The quiet resistance of language words can resist in silence. In the early 7th century BCE, long after Samaria's fall, a new dialect emerged in administrative texts across northern Mesopotamia. It was a strange hybrid Assyrian sentence structure, but with Semitic vocabulary from the west. Some called it a mistake, result of scribes trained poorly, but a few historians see something else: preservation. If your language is banned, change its grammar. If your gods are forbidden, embed them in names. If your history is forgotten, write it in the margins. And they did. In one Ostrakanen, in Kritan shard, a pottery a merchant named Neriah writes to his cousin in a village near the Kapper. The note is mundane: shipment delays, a missed caravan. But at the bottom, he writes, Shalom, the light remains, your brother. The light remains, a phrase without meaning in Assyrian, but in Hebrew, it echoes Psalms, and in exile, it is defiance. The things too heavy to carry when the Israelites were taken east. They did not carry the Ark of the Covenant. It was gone or hidden or never truly theirs. But they may have carried records of temple artifacts, descriptions, measurements, materials, lists of what once stood in Samaria's shrines. Some believe that among the lost scrolls are inventories of sacred items. These will not be spiritual texts, but bureaucratic ones. And that makes them all the more likely to be buried. Why? 'Cause they prove something existed. In the ruins of Ashur, Assyrian scribes once compiled tribute lists from conquered cities. These were dry, methodical tablets, one after another, of livestock, bronze, and wine. But Israel is missing. We have no Assyrian inventory for Samaria, no detailed record of what was taken from the temple, which suggests that something was hidden before the fall, and perhaps a scroll describing where it went and who carried it. The silent road back, they did not return. The Israelites exiled to Assyria, did not come back en masse. They were not like the Judahites who returned from Babylon under Cyrus. Instead, they faded into the lands where they were planted. And yet, Echoes of them remain. Centuries later, travelers along the Silk Road encountered villages of people who spoke strange dialects, used lunar calendars, and practiced abstinence on the seventh day. In western Iran, near Hamadan, local traditions describe a hill called the Mountain of a Scroll, where an old community once gathered to sing songs in a forgotten tongue. No scrolls remain, no gold, no names, only silence. And yet, something once was carried there, across desert and ruin, carried in arms that had known fire, carried in jars sealed with wax, carried in memory and buried. The Assyrian campaign had ended. The cities of the North Samaria, Tirzah, Hazor were little more than echoes in the dust. Some walls still stood, some altars still burned, but the people were gone, taken eastward, absorbed into the bowels of the empire, and with them went the remnants of their wealth. But wealth does not last in silence. Gold becomes myth, and myth becomes a whisper so faint only those who can't forget will still listen. The vanishing of gold Assyrian records are precise in many ways: dates, commanders, tribute, and destruction. But when it comes to the exact wealth taken from Samaria, the texts fall quiet. The Nimrod prism, an official Assyrian inscription, records the conquest of Israel's northern kingdom under Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V. It boasts of victories and relocations of broken kings and renamed provinces, but it never states what was looted. It gives no weight in gold, no tally of silver, no count of temple items. This is unusual. For other cities, Arpad, Damascus, Tyre, the records are clear. They speak of ivory thrones, bronze gates, silver rings, but not Israel. Why? One theory is that the spoils of Samaria were so sacred, or so politically sensitive, that they were deliberately omitted from official inscriptions. Another suggests that the gold was never looted at all, because it had already been hidden, by the Israelites themselves. And some say the gold was cursed, and no one wanted to admit it had ever passed through their hands. Hidden in transit, the journey east from Samaria was not a straight road. It wound through dry valleys and steep escarpments, along rivers that vanished, seasonally past towns that barely remembered who ruled them last. And in the pauses, the moments where Assyrian convoys rested, things disappeared. A bronze bowl, heavy with inscriptions, a golden lampstand shaped like an almond tree, sealed jar with temple wax still intact, gone, not stolen, not bartered, just absent by the next sunrise. Some guards were executed, others were reassigned, but the pattern held. The more sacred the object, the more likely it was to vanish before reaching the capital, the city where nothing was recorded. One Assyrian town, Khansabat, was constructed during this era, intended to be a new capital. It was lavish, geometrically perfect, and filled with reliefs depicting imperial triumphs. But something strange happened. It was abandoned just a decade after completion. Some believe the treasures of Samaria were meant to be housed here, that they arrived by cart and caravan, guarded by soldiers who didn't know what they carried. But then the king Sargon II died unexpectedly, and the city fell into disuse. 100 years later, when archaeologists uncovered Dersharukin, they found warehouses filled with tablets, but none mentioning Israel, and in a room without doors, buried beneath 2 feet of clay, they found a bronze mirror inscribed in a Hebrew script. It was polished, Untarniseg, as if someone had used it until the day it was sealed. And then, forgotten, the myth of the mountain cavern, oral traditions among later Jewish communities in Persia and Kurdistan speak of a mountain cavern, a deep cleft near the Zagros range, hidden by brush, difficult to reach without a local guide. The legend says that Levites fleeing captivity carried sacred items, heritums, too important to destroy, but too dangerous to be seen. They did not bury them, for the ground was too damp. They did not burn them, for the gold would survive and be found. So they lowered them into a cavern and sealed the opening with wax and stone. According to one Kurdish Jewish folktale, it's passed down in Aramaic. The items included a horned altar, 2 golden bowls engraved with the name Yahu, a scroll wrapped in blue linen, a weight stamped with the seal of Jeroboam. Such a cavern has ever been found. But each generation kept the story, and when one rabbi was asked whether he believed the treasure still existed, he simply said, "We remembered what they wanted us to forget." The turning of memory into currency's time passed. The descendants of the exiled Israelites were no longer prisoners. They became artisans, traders, scribes. They married locals. They adopted dialects, but some still remembered, and memory has value in the market cities of Assur and Nineveh. Merchants once sold amulets etched with old Hebrew blessings, small silver bands with writing so faded it could not be read but worn anyway for protection. And sometimes they told stories of a gold lampstand buried beneath a dry riverbed, of a holy stone set into the wall of a forgotten storehouse, a scroll that could only be read during a full moon when silence covered the desert. Bias came, and sometimes disappeared, because what if the story was real? What if the lampstand existed? What if the scroll could still be read? When empire fears the sacred, the Assyrian Empire eventually crumbled, not from invasion alone, but from within. Babylon rose. Borders shifted, courts were lost, cities emptied, and as new rulers came, they sought to erase the past. One Babylonian general ordered the burning of Assyrian temple registries. Another decreed that any foreign relics of gods, not of Marduk, were to be melted for coinage. But melting gold does not erase its meaning. When a priest touched a bowl inscribed with an unknown god's name, they often paused, and many items were not melted. They were simply stored in sealed vaults, in dark rooms, in river caves, the silence of the 10 tribes by the time of the Babylonian exile. The 10 lost tribes were already legend. Their names remains Ebulun, Naphtali, Asher, Reuben, but their people were scattered. Some lived as shepherds in the hills of Media, others as scribes in Elam, and some simply vanished. But the gold, the scrolls, the sacred things, they were not forgotten. Even centuries later, when Jews returned from Babylon to rebuild Jerusalem, legends persisted that the true ark, or the original altar stone, had been taken by the 10 tribes and hidden, and some searched for it still, not for power, not for gold, but for proof that memory mattered. When memory becomes sleep tonight, someone may sleep beside a river in western Iran. They may walk a path worn into the hills where no trees grow. They may pass a boulder that locals call the gate stone, and beneath it, just beneath a whisper, may still remain not a treasure, not gold, just the faintest residue of ash and a name, barely etched into limestone. Not Roman, not Greek, not Persian, just old, just quiet, just waiting, before the last torch was extinguished in the sanctuary, before the city gates fell under Assyrian steel. A quiet ritual unfolded inside the stone walls of Shechem. The priests of the northern kingdom, fewer than before and older than they should, have been gathered in silence. These were not the high priests of Jerusalem, cloaked in linen and crowned with gold. They were rural Levites, dust on their sleeves, calluses on their palms, and worry behind their eyes. They had no ark, no temple built by Solomon, no songs echoing through marble colonnades, but they had scrolls. They had silver vessels used for sacrifice. They had a memory of what worship once meant, before kings and kingdoms tried to carve God into something more useful, and they had time, a few hours, maybe less. The Assyrians were advancing. They could hear the footsteps in the valleys below, and so, beneath the fading light of the hilltop shrine, the priests began to wrap what they could carry. Not everything could be saved. The stone altar would stay. The ancient jars of oil would be buried beneath the courtyard. Ritual purity required burial. They could not be protected. But the silver, the silver was never meant to remain here. The value of purified silver in the ancient Israelite tradition. Gold was for kings, but silver was for the sacred, while the gold of Solomon's temple drew envy from abroad. It was silver that adorned the common sanctuaries, the high places, the wilderness shrines, and the portable tabernacles of earlier centuries. Silver bowls, small and plain, were used in offerings of grain and oil. Silver trumpets, called the faithful, at festivals. Silver shekels were donated as temple dues every 7th month by those who had no cattle to give. The Levites in Shechem possessed such items. 23 silver vessels recorded in oral inventory, and 7 small scroll containers made from silver plate, each etched with psalms in an early script. They were not rich men, but these were priceless, not because of their weight, but because of what they had survived. Some pieces came from the northern sanctuaries at Dan and Bethel, once grand and now deserted. Others were gifts from fleeing priests during earlier waves of conquest. And some, it was whispered, had traveled from even farther, rescued from the days of the judges, handed down from clans that had escaped both war and assimilation. To lose them now would be to sever the last fragile thread connecting the north to its ancient covenant. So they wrapped them in goatskin, in linen, in silence. The flight to Mount Ebal Shechem lies nestled between 2 mountains, Gerizim and Ebal. Mount Gerizim was holy, but exposed. Mount Ebal was cursed, but hidden. It was to Ebal the priests turned. A path, barely wider than a man's shoulders, wound upward behind the sanctuary herder's trail, marked by old cairns and the bleached bones of goats. It was not a road meant for dignity, but it was known to them. They had walked it during previous times of danger, never with more than a loaf of bread and a borrowed lamp. This time, they walked it with centuries in their hands. 3 priests, 1 apprentice, and a mule, too old for the journey, but willing. The sun had just dipped behind the distant ridge. The valley below glowed orange, and far in the east, the banners of the invaders flickered in the haze. No one spoke. It is said that the youngest priest, just 16, dropped his sandals along the path and never looked back for them, that the eldest hummed the same phrase of a psalm with every step, as though willing the rhythm to carry him forward, and that at the 3rd cairn still standing today, the mule stopped, turned its head west, and brayed once, before continuing on, at the top of the trail. Where the rocks turned black and the wind grew still, they reached a cleft, a cave, no wider than a single fig tree's shadow. They had known it was there, but few had ever entered. A chamber without a name sighed the cave. The air was cool and dry, no markings on the walls, no inscriptions or altars, just stone, the memory of rain. This was not a place for the living. It was a place of waiting by the light of a single oil lamp. They arranged the silver, not ceremonially. There was no time, just carefully. Each bowl placed in a hollow, each scroll tube wedged between natural pillars, and then stones, not to bury, but to shield. A wall built, not to last forever, but long enough. They did not pray aloud. They did not say farewell. They simply left, and as they descended, they covered the mouth of the cleft with brush and fallen branches, arranged as only a shepherd would know. Nothing sacred, nothing unusual, just the debris of the mountain. The last priest of Shechem of the priests returned to Shechem. The city was sacked within the day, its shrines defiled, its people dragged into exile. But one priest Eliab, the eldest, was captured alive. The records of his journey appeared nowhere in scripture, only in a fragmentary tablet found near Hama centuries later in a cuneiform trade document listing a holy man from the west, branded and mute. Mute, because his tongue had been removed. Holy, because he still wore the linen belt of a Levite, branded with the seal of the Assyrian governor. It is believed he lived another 10 years, assigned as a laborer in a temple compound near Nineveh, was never seen near silver. He never spoke again, but when he died, a small object was found sewn into the seam of his tunic, a silver coin, worn smooth, wrapped in a torn strip of parchment, with one word still legible, .ebal. When silence serves a cleft on Mount Ebal has never been officially excavated, rumors persist. Shepherds tell of strange echoes near the rocks. Locals speak of a spot where animals avoid grazing. And once, in the 1970s, a scholar from Tel Aviv published a short article proposing that the Ebal chamber might still contain one of the earliest intact collections of Israelite liturgical silver. The article was withdrawn. The scholar disappeared from the field, but the story did not fade. It drifted quietly to the oral traditions of Samaria, where old men still say, there are things too sacred to be found, and too real to be lost. Before the last torch was extinguished in the sanctuary, before the city gates fell under Assyrian steel, a quiet ritual unfolded inside the stone walls of Shechem. The priests of the northern kingdom, fewer than before and older than they should, have been gathered in silence. These were not the high priests of Jerusalem, cloaked in linen and crowned with gold. They were rural Levites, dust on their sleeves, calluses on their palms, and worry behind their eyes. They had no ark, no temple, built by Solomon, no songs echoing through marble colonnades, but they had scrolls. They had silver vessels used for sacrifice. They had a memory of what worship once meant, before kings and kingdoms tried to carve God into something more useful, and they had time, a few hours, maybe less. The Assyrians were advancing. They could hear the footsteps in the valleys below, and so, beneath the fading light of the hilltop shrine, the priests began to wrap what they could carry. Not everything could be saved. The stone altar would stay. The ancient jars of oil would be buried beneath the courtyard. Ritual purity required burial. They could not be protected. But the silver, the silver was never meant to remain here. The value of purified silver in the ancient Israelite tradition. Gold was for kings, but silver was for the sacred, while the gold of Solomon's temple drew envy from abroad. It was silver that adorned the common sanctuaries, the high places, the wilderness shrines, and the portable tabernacles of earlier centuries. Silver bowls, small and plain, were used in offerings of grain and oil. Silver trumpets, called the faithful, at festivals. Silver shekels were donated as temple dues every 7th month by those who had no cattle to give. The Levites in Shechem possessed such items. 23 silver vessels recorded in oral inventory, and 7 small scroll containers made from silver plate, each etched with psalms in an early script. They were not rich men, but these were priceless, not because of their weight, but because of what they had survived. Some pieces came from the northern sanctuaries at Dan and Bethel, once grand and now deserted. Others were gifts from fleeing priests during earlier waves of conquest. And some, it was whispered, had traveled from even farther, rescued from the days of the judges, handed down from clans that had escaped both war and assimilation. To lose them now would be to sever the last fragile thread connecting the north to its ancient covenant. So they wrapped them in goatskin, in linen, in silence. The flight to Mount Ebal Shechem lies nestled between 2 mountains, Gerizim and Ebal. Mount Gerizim was holy, but exposed. Mount Ebal was cursed, but hidden. It was to Ebal the priests turned. A path, barely wider than a man's shoulders, wound upward behind the sanctuary herder's trail, marked by old cairns and the bleached bones of goats. It was not a road meant for dignity, but it was known to them. They had walked it during previous times of danger, never with more than a loaf of bread and a borrowed lamp. This time, they walked it with centuries in their hands. 3 priests, 1 apprentice, and a mule, too old for the journey, but willing. The sun had just dipped behind the distant ridge. The valley below glowed orange, and far in the east, the banners of the invaders flickered in the haze. No one spoke. It is said that the youngest priest, just 16, dropped his sandals along the path and never looked back for them, that the eldest hummed the same phrase of a psalm with every step, as though willing the rhythm to carry him forward, and that at the 3rd cairn still standing today, the mule stopped, turned its head west, and brayed once, before continuing on, at the top of the trail. Where the rocks turned black and the wind grew still, they reached a cleft, a cave no wider than a single fig tree's shadow. They had known it was there, but few had ever entered. A chamber without a name sighed the cave. The air was cool and dry, no markings on the walls, no inscriptions or altars, just stone, the memory of rain. This was not a place for the living. It was a place of waiting by the light of a single oil lamp. They arranged the silver, not ceremonially. There was no time, just carefully. Each bowl placed in a hollow, each scroll tube wedged between natural pillars, and then stones, not to bury, but to shield. A wall built, not to last forever, but long enough. They did not pray aloud. They did not say farewell. They simply left, and as they descended, they covered the mouth of the cleft with brush and fallen branches, arranged as only a shepherd would know. Nothing sacred, nothing unusual, just the debris of the mountain. The last priest of Shechem of the priests returned to Shechem. The city was sacked within the day, its shrines defiled, its people dragged into exile. But one priest Eliab, the eldest, was captured alive. The records of his journey appeared nowhere in scripture, only in a fragmentary tablet found near Hama centuries later in a cuneiform trade document listing a holy man from the west, branded and mute. Mute because his tongue had been removed. Holy because he still wore the linen belt of a Levite, branded with the seal of the Assyrian governor. It is believed he lived another 10 years, assigned as a laborer in a temple compound near Nineveh, was never seen near silver. He never spoke again, but when he died, a small object was found sewn into the seam of his tunic, a silver coin, worn smooth, wrapped in a torn strip of parchment, with one word still legible, .ebal. When silence serves a cleft on Mount Ebal has never been officially excavated, rumors persist. Shepherds tell of strange echoes near the rocks. Locals speak of a spot where animals avoid grazing. And once, in the 1970s, a scholar from Tel Aviv published a short article proposing that the Ebal chamber might still contain one of the earliest intact collections of Israelite liturgical silver. The article was withdrawn. The scholar disappeared from the field, but the story did not fade. It drifted quietly to the oral traditions of Samaria, where old men still say, there are things too sacred to be found, and too real to be lost. The northern kingdom was gone. Samaria lay in ash, and its people scattered. Some had been deported to Hala, others to Gozan on the Haba River, and still more 2 cities whose names were whispered only in captivity. What remained of Israel's 10 tribes were fragments, families with no land, elders with no altars, and songs no longer sung in the open, but somewhere far from the eyes of kings and generals. The memory of silver hidden on Mount Ebal still lived in whispers and half prayers. in the worn fingers of men who once served in the shrines of Shechem and Danda, and among them, in the shaded corner of a small Judean village called Ein Gedi, sat a scribe with a limp and a secret. His name was Messiah, and he had not forgotten. The exiles, apprentice Amaziah, had been a boy when the priests fled Shechem, not yet old enough to carry the silver, but old enough to remember the weight of it in their hands, old enough to recognize the look on their faces as they sealed the cave, not with triumph, but with resignation. When the Assyrians came, Messiah had been hidden beneath a merchant's carts, smuggled out with barrels of wine and a forged receipt for spoiled olives. He never saw the priests again, but he kept the path to Ebal in his mind like others remember a psalm, slowly, in rhythm, with reverence. 20 years later, Messiah was a scribe in Judea. His limp, the result of a collapsed stone wall during an earthquake in Jericho, forced him to work slowly. His Hebrew was old-fashioned, his Aramaic poor, but his knowledge of the old northern traditions of festivals, its measurements, priestly codes, was unmatched, and he carried with him a scroll, not one of the sacred silver tubes. Those had been sealed. This was something else. A copy, a rough one, written in haste on the eve of the Assyrian arrival. It contained only a list of what was hidden. The list, by candlelight. Messiah would unfold it. Not often, perhaps once every few years, but always with care. The parchment, stretched thin and browned at the edges, bore a narrow hand. The names of objects were listed in early Hebrew: bowls, vessels, a trumpet, scroll containers, each item marked with a symbol likely referring to its placement inside the cave. At the end of the list, written in a smaller, more cramped script, were 5 additional lines. They mentioned no silver, they named no objects, only people. 5 names, Levites, from different towns, including Shechem, Tirzah, and Jezreel. And beside each name, date, or rather, a number counted from the fall of Samaria. Messiah puzzled over them for years. Were these death dates, appointments, codes? But one detail stood out. Each date was separated by exactly 7 years. The silence of 7 in the northern traditions. The number 7 was tied not only to creation, but to release. Every 7th year was a Shemitic year of letting go. Fields were left fallow. Debts were canceled. Slaves were released. And in the scroll Messiah held, the sequence of years hinted at something similar. A cycle of remembrance, or perhaps a hidden appointment. Ritual of return. Could it be that? The priests had planned for someone to revisit the cave every 7th year. Had others gone back? Had they survived? And if the last name on the list, dated 28 years after the fall, was meant to represent the final keeper, was Messiah, now the only one left. The journey back he left without ceremony. He told no one. He walked with a stick, and slowly, traveling only at dusk and dawn to avoid attention. The path north was dangerous. Bandits roamed the hill country, and Samaria, though conquered, still bore the bruises of rebellion and resettlement. The Assyrians had planted foreign populations among the ruins. People from Babylon, Cutha, Hamathu, did not know the old ways and distrusted travelers. But Messiah passed like a shadow. His clothes were plain, his eyes downcast. When he reached the hills near Shechem, he veered west, avoiding the ruins, and as the stars gathered above Mount Ebal, he found the old shepherd's path. The cairns were gone, but the bones of goats remained. At the 3rd bend in the trail, he paused. Here, the mule had once turned its head, and just beyond, where the path narrowed to a thread, Messiah saw it. The cleft, still hidden, still waiting. Inside the chamber, the brush covering the entrance was long decayed. The cave mouth gaped like a forgotten memory, open to the wind, but untouched by time. Inside, Messiah lit a small oil lamp. The stones remained, the silver, Disturbed, he did not move them. He did not touch them. He sat, and for the first time in 30 years, he wept, not for what was lost, but for what had been preserved. The whispered decision: he could not take the silver. To do so would invite questions, thieves, kings, priests, eager for relics to prove their lineage. But he could leave something. Messiah, with his broken hand and aching legs, produced his scroll, and beneath the final line, in a space meant for the last keeper, he added one word: waiting. Then he placed the scroll, no longer a list, but now a testimony, between two stones near the entrance, just inside the reach of light, and sealed the gap with clay dot, not to keep the world out, but to let someone, someday, find their way back in. The scroll that no one opened, that scroll, sealed in clay, would not be found until the late 19th century, when a European surveyor, following a trail of unusual shepherd stories, discovered a shallow cave on Mount Ebal containing loose stones and a dry fragment of clay dot inside. The parchment was half-decayed, but the word at the end still legible: waiting. The silver has never been found. Some believe it lies deeper in the cave. Others say it was removed centuries earlier by a priest who said nothing and left no mark but the scroll. The scroll that named what was once hidden and who had vowed to protect it. That remains a reminder that some treasures were never meant to be displayed, only remembered. The word waiting sat preserved in pale ink, pressed between stone and clay, quietly surviving what history could not. The treasure hidden in the cave on Mount Ebal, treasure it truly was, had never been touched, never been looted, never been moved, and, perhaps most curiously of all, it had never been searched for by the people who needed it most, because no one truly knew what they were looking for. They only remembered that something had been taken, and something else had been left behind after the scrolled European surveyor who discovered the parchment in the late 1800s was named Gustav Thomson. He was no archaeologist, just a railway engineer hired to assess the hilly terrain between Ifa and Nablus. He camped for one night near the eastern slope of Mount Ebal and wandered into the cleft after noticing that shepherds refused to tether their flocks nearby. They called the slope the Hollow of the Suns, and said no animal would sleep near it, not even a thirsty goat. Inside the cave, Thomson found two things: a patch of hardened soil with an odd ridge of clay, and after some brushing away, a brittle, layered scroll that fell apart as he handled it. But one fragment remained, that single Hebrew word, Mekaka, waiting. He brought it home, and then forgot it. It would sit in a drawer of his study in Denmark until his death, and even then, it might have disappeared with his personal belongings had it not been for his daughter, Clara, who recognized the language and donated the piece to a museum in Copenhagen in 1910. But no further investigation occurred for another 60 years. An Israeli scholar and a Danish archive in 1974, Dr. Avishai Kedem, a mild-mannered expert in Second Temple Judaism, stumbled upon the fragment during a research visit to the museum in Denmark. He was looking for old liturgical seals, not Northern Kingdom artifacts, but the label caught his eye. Ancient Hebrew fragment, origin unknown, term Makaka. What drew Kedem's interest wasn't just the word, but the suggestion that this was not part of a religious scroll. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't legal code. It wasn't scripture. It was a word written at the end, a closing thought. Kedem knew of no other ancient scrolls that concluded with a solitary word like this, especially one so passive. Most scrolls declared. They ended with Amen, or so be it, or blessed be his name. But this one waited excavation. Kodkin's quiet fascination grew into a formal proposal. He contacted the Israeli Antiquities Authority and requested a minor excavation permit near the Ebel slope. Just a few shallow pits. No explosives. No machinery. He was denied. Mount Ebal had long been a politically sensitive area, so many competing claims, too many whispered legends. Any mention of a treasure cave would ignite controversy and accusations of religious provocation. So, Kidam waited too. He returned to his books, his lectures, his aging office filled with dust and notes. But he kept a framed photo of the parchment on his shelf, just the word, enlarged so that the ink cracks looked like rivers on a desert map. He said nothing publicly, but he told his granddaughter, Oral. Chain's her name was Leora, and she was 12 when she first heard the story. Not the public one, not the part about scrolls or silver, just the whisper that once, long ago, when kingdoms fell and priests fled, someone had written down a list, and that list had ended not with closure, but with anticipation. A pause across time.mechak. The word hung in her mind for years, through school, through military service, through her doctoral work in comparative religion, and when she finally visited the cave herself without a permit, without any institutional support, it was on a clouded morning in 2006, armed with a single camera and a deep sense that she would find nothing. And she did exactly that. The cleft was there, empty. Whatever had once been hidden, or even marked by stone or brush, had long since faded. The cave smelled of damp limestone and bird droppings. A single coin-laid Roman lay near the mouth, so corroded to be of value. She sat for an hour, and then wrote one word on a small piece of parchment. She pressed it into the dry space between two rocks near the back of the cave, not to recreate what was once done, but to continue it. The theology of incompletion. Modern scholars rarely speak of the 10 lost tribes in archaeological terms. Too much uncertainty, too many forgeries, pseudo-histories, and fringe theories. But in theological studies, the subject remains fertile ground, not because of what was lost, but because of what was never resolved. In most traditions, loss invites ritual destruction, is followed by rebuilding, exile by return, mourning by restoration. But the 10 tribes vanished without closure. No record of their full assimilation, no clear martyrdom, no specific relics, just silence, the kind that doesn't come from burial, but from being put aside. And that silence, theologians say, is a kind of treasure too, a sacred waiting, a recognition that some things in history are not meant to be concluded. They are meant to stay open, like the cave, like the list, like the final word on a scroll. Echoes in other traditions. Curiously, echoes of this idea appear in other ancient cultures as well. In old Akkadian exile texts, a phrase often appears near the end, to be recorded again. In early Persian scrolls, certain archives bear a stamp that translates as held in trust for later. Even in the earliest Christian monastic records, some objects, especially those confiscated from earlier temples, are marked not with inventory numbers, but with the symbol of a closed eye, meaning not forgotten, not destroyed, just waiting. So, perhaps the silver hidden on Mount Ebal, whether it was coins or bowls or only memory, was never meant to be recovered. Perhaps it was meant to remain buried, a monument, not a possession, but of restraint, the quiet legacy of Mazia, the scribe, truly existed, and no record confirms he did. Then his greatest act was not copying sacred scrolls or hiding physical treasure. His greatest act was remembering, keeping a list, adding one word, and walking away. He could have sold the secret, revealed the cave, claimed the silver, founded a priestly line, but he did none of that because he understood something the powerful often forget, that sometimes the most enduring treasures are the ones we choose not to claim. The cave to Noat. Ebal is still quiet. The cleft still exists. though few know of it. No signs, no fences, no plaques. The path is overgrown. The birds are louder now. The stones don't remember names, but in a certain kind of wind. If you're standing at the right bend in the trail near where a shepherd's mule once turned its head some, say it feels like the mountain is listening, not speaking, just waiting, as if the mountain remembers something you don't, and maybe never will, and maybe aren't meant to. There is a strange kind of memory found not in the mind, but in ink, frail, fading, yet precise. The kind that doesn't speak aloud, but waits to be read, and not just once, over and over, slowly, until someone, somewhere, remembers the meaning of each name. One such memory, it is said, was buried in a dry limestone cavern in the Judean desert. The scroll was never opened in its own time, and that, some believe, was its true purpose. It was a list, but not an inventory, not of food, not of tools. It was a list of things meant not to be found, and the silence around it was part of the design. A strange fragment in Cave 3. The year was 1952, just a few years after the first Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The caves of Qumran were being searched with increasing urgency by scholars, smugglers, and shepherd boys alike. In one of the lesser-known caves, Cave 3, smaller and more difficult to access, a group of Bedouin diggers found a cylindrical object unlike anything seen in the previous caves. It wasn't parchment, it wasn't leather, it was copper. A scroll, made of thin copper sheets, rolled tightly, covered in ancient Hebrew, its letters etched, not written, its words preserved not by ink, but by acid scoring on metal. It took years before scholars could unroll it. The copper was brittle, and it had been folded deliberately, some believed, to make reading impossible without destruction. Eventually, piece by piece, the scroll was opened, and what it revealed was something no one had expected. It wasn't prophecy. It wasn't scripture. It was directions. The copper scroll's mystery. The scroll listed 64 locations. Each entry followed a strange rhythm. In the valley of Acre, under the third milestone, 40 cubits deep, silver coins, weight, she talents. In the cistern beside the orchard of Shechem, beneath the plaster, gold ingots, 7 talents. In the tomb of the priestess, to the right of the stone column, sacred vessels, incense jars, and bronze lamps, one after another, all treasures, all bearing no instructions to recover them. No names of guardians, no seals, just silent, practical directions, like someone whispering to the earth where the bones had been hidden. Was it real? Many doubted it. Some said the scroll was a hoax, a fantasy, fragment of fiction written during desperate times. But the details were strangely convincing. Weights were given imprecise talents. Landmarks matched known geography. Materials were consistent with known sacred inventories. And most telling of all, there was no mention of any individual name. No king, no priest, no temple official, just the treasures and their graves. Who would forge such a thing, and why? If it were fantasy, it would have been more dramatic. If it were fraud, there would be a payoff. But the scroll had no conclusion, no climax, just a list that stopped. And at the bottom, like a dying breath, and in the cistern, in the courtyard of the ruins, beneath the ashes, there is also a scroll. A scroll about scrolls. That final line puzzled researchers. Why mention a scroll? If the scroll being described wasn't the copper one itself, then what was it? Some believed it was the real inventory, the parchment master list from which the copper scroll was derived. The version written in haste, or secrecy, or both. Buried, not for safekeeping, but for forgetting. They called it the Forgotten Scroll, though no copy was ever found. But rumors persisted, and by the early 1980s, one peculiar theory emerged among certain religious scholars, that this unknown scroll wasn't just an index, It was an act of erasure, a list of treasures meant to be lost. Deliberately, the theory of ritual, disappearance in Jewish tradition. Canis is the practice of storing sacred texts that are damaged or no longer in use. They are not destroyed. They are hidden because the name of God cannot be thrown away. But what if the same principle was applied not to texts but to objects? Some scholars suggested that in times of extreme crisis, such as the destruction of a temple or the exile of a people, priests may have extended the logic of Genesa to gold, silver, vessels, even altars, not out of greed, not even out of preservation, but as a form of sacred silence to ensure these objects could never be desecrated, never misused, never politicized. And in that context, the copper scroll becomes not a map, but a tombstone. In the missing parchment scroll, a eulogy. Why bury a list? The goal was to forget. Why write it down at all? That question has haunted researchers for decades, and the most poetic answer comes not from a historian, but from a quiet essay written by a linguist named Noam Ravid in 1999. Memory is not always for retrieval. Sometimes it is for the dignity of forgetting. To bury a list is to say, this existed, and we chose not to touch it again. In this view, the copper scroll is not an invitation to treasure hunt. It is an elegy, a record of restraint, of sacred things. Intentionally let go modern excavations, despite the caution of scholars. Others saw opportunity in the 2000s. Few independent diggers began searching the sites described in the copper scroll. Some were found: empty cisterns, collapsed ruins, carved stones with no treasure beneath. But one site near Kiryat Kinos revealed something strange: a layer of ash. Beneath it, ancient plaster, and embedded in the plaster, small metal fragments, scorched and folded, too damaged to read, but chemically tested. They were nearly identical in composition to the copper of the original scroll. Could this be the reference in line 64? Was this the scroll buried beneath the ashes? If so, then the scroll about scrolls had been found. Too late to read, too broken to decipher. There, real and waiting questions that remain to this day. The copper scroll remains the most unusual of all Dead Sea Scrolls. It has no parallel in the other caves, no spiritual commentary, no prophecy, no narrative, just a list of items never recovered, and perhaps never meant to be. Was it written by priests of the Qumran community? Or by survivors of the Jerusalem temple? Was it real or ritual? Was it a burial of wealth or a final, desperate act of reverence? The answers may never come, but the list remains, etched into copper, folded in silence, buried in stone, and one word hangs above it all. Why? Why? The copper scroll does not name a single individual, not one scribe, not one priest, not even a witness to say, this was written by my hand. And yet, someone made it. Someone etched each letter, slowly, into metal. Someone buried it in cave. 3. Someone chose not to retrieve it. Who were they? Kent. Why would they go to such lengths to list vast treasures, only to hide the list itself? To begin to answer that question, we must return to a place that was both a city and a cause. We return to Jerusalem, not the Jerusalem of Solomon or Herod, but the Jerusalem that smoldered in ruins and still remembered what it once stood. The priesthood without a temple by the time the copper scroll was likely composed, sometime between 68 and 73 CE. The great temple in Jerusalem had already been destroyed by the Romans. Its fires had ended an era that had lasted nearly 1,000 years. The sacred vessels were taken as trophies, marched through the streets of Rome, their images carved forever on the Arch of Titus. And yet, not everything had been looted. There were Rumors, whispers, of temple priests who escaped during the chaos. Scrolls carried out in baskets of gold and silver, quickly hidden, not to preserve wealth, but to keep it from desecration. These priests, now exiles from their own sanctuary, carried the burden of memory. They knew what the temple had held. They knew the rules of purity, and they knew which items could never be used again, not without a temple to house them. And so they did what priests were trained to do. They preserved ritual by turning it kit. But this time, the ritual wasn't about sacrifice or prayer. It was about erasure, holy forgetting. The Qumran connection, the location of the Copper Scroll's discovery, Cave 3, near Qumran, is no accident. Qumran was more than a desert refuge. It was a community bound by rules, codes, and silence. It was home to a group known as the Essenes, ascetic Jews who believed the temple in Jerusalem had become corrupt and impure long before the Romans arrived. They wrote their own scrolls, dozens of them, commentaries, laws, hymns, and among them strange texts known as the War Scrolls, describing an apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and sons of darkness. These were people who believed that the world was about to end, and in their worldview, the sacred items of the temple were not simply loot or liturgy. They were dangerous. Dangerous because they could be misused. Dangerous because they still held symbolic power. Dangerous because they tied the people to a past that could never be restored. And so, perhaps, they agreed to help the fleeing priests of Jerusalem. Perhaps they allowed the scroll, or composed it themselves, and sealed it in copper, not as a map, but as a cord to the past, meant to be tied off, a ritual of concealment in ancient Jewish practice. The act of hiding sacred things was sometimes referred to as nisa, the setting aside of that which could not be destroyed. It must not be seen again. This was usually applied to writings that included the name of God, but in extreme times, many scholars now believe that principle may have extended to sacred vessels, gold implements, and ritual objects, particularly those that had touched the inner sanctum of the temple. To use them again would be desecration. To destroy them would be unthinkable. So the only answer left was concealment, permanent, ritual, intentional. The Copper Scroll may have been their final act of priesthood, a ledger, not for taxes, not for inventory, but for conscience. They wrote it to witness the burial of sacred things, and then they buried the witness. The weight of talents. The scroll repeatedly lists treasure weights in talents. A single talent was approximately 33 kilograms, about 73 pounds, when the scroll claims that one deposit contains 17 talents of silver. It's describing over 1,200 pounds of metal. This raises two difficult questions. Where did such vast quantities of treasure come from? Why haven't any other deposits ever been recovered? The first question has many answers. The temple had received offerings from across the Jewish world, pilgrims, taxes, foreign gifts. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, the wealth inside the temple before its fall was unimaginable. It is entirely possible that some of that wealth was spirited away during the siege, not in wagons, not in fanfare, but quietly, in sacks, in buried jars, carried out by those who knew the city's tunnels. As for the second question, why nothing has been found, the answer may be more symbolic than logistical. Some locations were likely destroyed. Others may lie beneath modern cities. But more than that, perhaps no one has truly tried, because to dig up these sites would not simply be archaeology. It would be profanation. To disturb what was buried for the sake of holy forgetting is to undo the silence that was made sacred. And for the descendants of those who buried it, that may still be too much. The Roman memory machine, while the Jewish community buried its sacred objects in silence. The Romans celebrated their victory in stone, the Arch of Titus. still standing in Rome today, shows the menorah being carried through the streets. Coins were minted with the inscription, Judea capta, Judea captured. Temples to victory were built using the gold taken from Jerusalem. To the empire, memory was something to be carved. To the priests, memory was something to be sealed. These opposing philosophies help explain the copper scroll's uniqueness. The Romans didn't care about lists. They displayed what they stole, but the priests didn't want the treasures found. They wanted them named and forgotten. And so, once again, we are left with a paradox. A list of things meant never to be recovered, etched in metal, so they'd never fade. It's hidden, so they'd never be seen. When time is the barriers, thousands of years later, we possess that list, and yet we still don't know how to read it fully. The coordinates are cryptic, the distances imprecise, some names are lost. Two shifting place names and forgotten trails. Archaeologists have tried to map the references, overlaying ancient maps with modern geography. A few possible sites have been excavated, yielding nothing. And maybe that's the point. The scroll was not meant for us. It was meant for no one. It is a ghost of memory, built to remain unsolved, and in that unsolved space, it still serves the function its writers intended to say, this was here. We let it go. Do not follow a tradition of quiet even today in some Jewish communities. When a sacred text becomes too damaged to use, it is placed in a geniza, a hidden repository, often inside a synagogue wall or underground, not because it holds monetary value, but because it once held divine value. To hide it is not abandonment, it is reverence. And perhaps that's what the copper scroll reflects. Not wealth, not secrecy, but reverence carried out to its final conclusion. There may still be silver in the desert. There may still be gold beneath a collapsed cistern, but the scroll remains untouched, because perhaps it was never about finding the treasure. It was about making sure someone, someday, would remember that it existed, not to recover it, but to respect its burial. And that too is a kind of preservation. There is a quiet moment that every archaeologist dreams of and dreads. It is not the sound of the first shovel striking stone, nor the gasp when gold appears from beneath centuries of soil. It is the moment when something is found, a scroll, a shard, a word, and no one can read it. A script that no longer lives, a dialect only half survived, a map with no legend, a document whose secrets are visible and yet sealed. That was the moment when the copper scroll was unrolled, not for a priest, not for a scribe, but for a man named Joseph Milik, a scroll that would not open when the copper scroll was discovered. In 1952, it was already an enigma. Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls, written on parchment or papyrus, this one had been etched onto copper, mixed with a trace of tin. And it had not aged kindly. The metal had oxidized and hardened. It was brittle, flaking. A single unrolling would have destroyed it. So the scroll remained curled, a frozen spiral of reddish-green dot. To even read its surface required something sacrificial. They would have to cut it. In 1955, scholars at Manchester College of Technology used a tiny saw to slice the scroll into 23 thin strips. Each was a rectangle of ancient code, covered in tight Hebrew characters, rendered in a rough, almost hurried hand. And it fell to Milik, a young Polish scholar, working in Jerusalem, to read it. Milik's Prodigios. Milik was no ordinary scholar. He was one of the first to catalog the Dead Sea Scrolls, and his mind moved fluently across ancient Semitic languages. He understood the paleography, the way letters were shaped, the clues in slanted lines and curling ends. But the copper scroll was different. Its words were old, even by biblical standards. Its grammar was broken, its references obscure. Still, Milik persisted. He translated the scroll line by line, identified its measurements and weights, rendered its riddles into something legible. Though not always understandable, he published his findings, and then, in a quiet gesture as haunting as the scroll itself, he withdrew from the project. A list with no footsteps mixed translations revealed what we now accept, that the copper scroll was not a law code, nor a religious teaching, but a list of treasure deposits. It recorded 64 separate locations, each one described in vague terms: under the steps at the entrance to the third chamber, within the aqueduct, 40 cubits from the reservoir, beneath the great stone marked by the unknown word. Akeen also noted something else: the lack of footsteps. There were no instructions for how to retrieve the treasures, ritual for uncovering them, no indication that anyone ever meant to return. And so, for all his brilliance, he came to a strange and reluctant conclusion. The scroll was not a map. It was a monument. The dead ledgers in museums across the world. There are ledgers from monasteries, temples, and royal treasuries, some dating back thousands of years. Many list assets: grain, sheep, offerings, spices, land plots. But there's one curious trait shared by the most sacred of these ledgers. They are not balanced. That is, they do not include subtractions. No record of where something went. No signature confirming an item was withdrawn, because the record itself was the act of sanctifying. In the same way that a prayer does not require a response, the copper scroll does not require discovery. Its list is its function. It names the sacred, and then buries the name. And once the list was made, it was complete. Scrolls that cannot be held. When the copper scroll was placed on display, briefly, in Jordan and later in museums abroad, it attracted thousands of viewers. Some came expecting secrets. Some came expecting gold. But what they saw was simple: cracked copper, crude script, and a silence that no translation could fill. It is still there today in fragments. Its text digitized, debated, doubted, and admired. But no one has found the treasures. No one has confirmed even a single location. And no one knows whether the scroll was ever meant to be read again after it was buried. Perhaps Milik was the last reader who could read it without expecting anything in return. The ethics of retrieval among archaeologists and biblical scholars. There is an unspoken question surrounding the copper scroll. Should we even try to recover the treasure? It is not a matter of logistics, though many sites lie beneath cities, military zones, or are lost to time. It is a matter of ethics. If the scroll was a ritual act, final service by a dying priesthood, then to dig is to violate that ritual. If the treasure is tied to sacred vessels, not gold coins, then to display it in a museum may be sacrilege. And if the scroll's purpose was to witness a burial, then recovery is not rescue, it is desecration. So the debate remains: is it a treasure map or a tombstone? And who has the right to decide? The scroll's ecosystem believed the scroll was created as a last act of defiance, that even as the Romans closed in, the priests chose to preserve what they could, not by running, but by hiding. Some believe the scroll was a test, that only those with pure motives would be allowed to understand it, and some believe it was simply a record, a clerk's work, mundane and literal, in that we have imbued it with too much poetry. But history has taught us something strange. The longer a mystery survives, the more sacred it becomes. The copper scroll has not been solved, and, in that unresolved state, it now occupies a space few artifacts ever reach. It has become a symbol of what was lost, of what was hidden, of what we may never be meant to recover. A thought for the sleeper as you lie here, drifting in and out of thought. Consider this: some of the greatest acts of memory were not monuments, or books, or sermons. They were bodies. But of meaning, the copper scroll was not a prophecy, not a guide, but a quiet door, closing on a world that once burned with sacred light. The men who made it did not know you would read their words. They wrote for silence. They wrote to let go. And that, perhaps, is the final gift of the copper scroll. Not the treasure it names, but the reminder that some things are most sacred when they are never found. Sleep now in that silence, and let the past keep its peace. The marketplaces of antiquity were not always grand arenas filled with shouting merchants and golden scales. Sometimes they were silent exchanges between conqueror and captive, not measured in trade, but in loss, not in weight, but in what could no longer be carried. By the time the 10 lost tribes were marched from their lands in the late 8th century BCE, what remained of their kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel, had already been stripped. Its kings had paid tribute to Assyria for generations. First to Tiglath-Pileser III, then to Shalmaneser V, and finally to Sargon II. But when the northern kings could no longer pay in silver, they paid in kind, and in kind often meant gold, vessels from the temple, copper gates from Samaria, to the ornaments of homes that once belonged to the priestly class. But there was something more valuable than all of it, something harder to replace: human labor. And so began the quietest transaction in Israel's history, the sale of a people, the quiet melting of their memory into the coinage of empires. The marketplace that had no name there is no single location. Historians can point to and say, here is where the Israelites were sold. The records are scattered. The Assyrians did not name their slave markets the way they named their battlefields, but archaeology speaks in fragments. We know that prisoners of war were sold in fortified garrisons, often near the border zones of Hama and Haran. We know that Sumerian captives were marched to cities like Guzana and Nineveh, and we know from a faint inscription on a trade tablet that a woman from Bet-Hamriah, the Assyrian name for the kingdom of Israel, was sold for 3 shekels of silver. That was the value of a life once tied to prophecy, temple rites, and a tribal inheritance. 3 shekels. A loaf of barley bread cost 1. A donkey might cost 10. The weight of a history had become Pocketabl. That had a voice what happened to the treasures of the northern tribes, the sacred vessels, the golden breastplates of priests, the inscribed horns, the oil lamps marked with the Yahweh symbol. There is no master list, no temple ledger from the fall, but there is a strange trail, and it begins not in Israel, but in Assyrian temples, in the temple of Ishtar in Arbela. Modern-day Erbil set of gold utensils was discovered during a 19th century excavation, many of which bear Hebrew letters etched awkwardly over older Assyrian runes. These were not newly crafted objects. They were repurposed, transformed. One ladle bore the Hebrew word for purification. Another had a crooked rendering of the priestly blessing. These weren't gifts, they were spoils. Gold that once spoke in ritual now served another god, or perhaps none at all. The gold of Israel had a voice, but no place to sing. The quiet collapse of identity. Most of the people of the 10 tribes were not priests. They were farmers, brickmakers, midwives, herdsmen, and when they were taken into captivity, they brought very little, not because they had nothing, but because what they had was not portable. Land could not be carried. Genealogy could not be proven without temple records. Even names were often changed. Yosef became a Supul, Dan became Tanu, written in cuneiform ink that misheard and misunderstood. It wasn't just a people that disappeared, it was a framework of value. What made a man rich in Samaria? His orchard, his elder's blessing, his proximity to the altar meant nothing in Assyria. And so the gold remained, but the meaning of it drained away, and in its place came the only currency the empire trusted: labor, the empire's equation to Assyria. The logic was simple. A conquered province had to pay tribute in silver, in grain, in soldiers. When it failed, it was dismantled, its ruling class killed or enslaved, cities leveled and resettled. But here was the key. The conquest was not the end. It was the beginning of economic utility. Captured Israelites were not left to rot in camps. They were redeployed as bricklayers in Babylon, as irrigation specialists along the Tigris, as metalworkers in the copper mines near Elam. Their gold was melted down, marked with the Assyrian star. Their children were renamed. Their stories scattered. The empire did not erase them with swords. It erased them with ledgers, and the books balanced the currency of memory even today, in museums and private collections. There are coins from the 8th and 7th centuries BCE that bear no king's face, only symbols: a palm tree, a lyre, a mountain with smoke. Some scholars believe these were coins minted by displaced Hebrew communities long after their tribes had disappeared. Not official currency, not temple money, but tokens, memories. One such coin, found in modern-day Syria, carries this strange image of a broken staff and a sheaf of wheat, perhaps a reference to Joseph's dream in Genesis. It weighs just under 4 grams. It is crude, barely round. On its edge is a scratched inscription in Paleo-Hebrew. It reads, "He remembers." Who? A brother, a people. No one knows, but the coin exists, and that may be all it was meant to do. Barley for a blessing. There's a story preserved in a later rabbinical text. Not quite history, but perhaps memory softened into myth. It tells of a man named Haniel, a descendant of the tribe of Naphtali, who lived in exile near the city of Haran. His family had hidden a small gold medallion, one etched with the name of the Most High, for 3 generations, not to sell, not to display, but to remember. When famine struck the city, Haniel went to the local market and tried to exchange the medallion for barley. The merchant refused, not because it was too valuable, but because it was worthless to him. He could not weigh its name. He could not spend its sanctity. In the end, Haniel buried it under an almond tree and traded his shoes for food instead. The final sale by the 6th century BCE. When the southern kingdom of Judah fell to Babylon, the 10 tribes were already a whisper. Their descendants may have lived among the Babylonians. Their names may have become Akkadian, their songs forgotten, but their gold, if it remained, had long since passed hands. In the end, what happened to it? Some was melted into Assyrian religious objects, some perhaps reused by Babylonians. Much of it lost to time, reworked into coins that bore no memory of where it came from. Still lies buried in caves near the borderlands of old Samaria, nameless, contextless, silent. A quiet question as you rest here tonight, letting these details drift gently through your mind. Consider this: what is value without memory? If the gold remains, but the people who understood it do not, is it treasure or simply metal? Is a lamp sacred if it no longer lights the words of a prophet? Is a coin holy if it cannot buy back what was lost? And what if the last marketplace was not a place at all, but a moment? A moment when a man gave up his inheritance, not for silver, not for gold, but for bread, for bread. Long after the carts of gold vanished into the vaults of Nineveh, and the captives of Israel were scattered among strange cities and forgotten names. A different kind of survival began, one not built of coin or conquest, but of endurance and anonymity. This is the story not of kings, but of those who lived after the fall, who endured without monuments, and who buried their customs in foreign soil like seeds, sometimes to grow, sometimes to vanish. The empire's quietest strategy, assimilation. Assyria had perfected something the Babylonians would later inherit: the resettlement model. Instead of slaughtering all conquered peoples, the Assyrians moved them far from their homelands, but not into dungeons. They believed in repurposing human capital. They scattered the Israelites across the vast terrain of their empire, placing them beside peoples with different gods, different languages, and no shared memory. They knew something simple, but powerful. If you wanted people to disappear, don't kill them. I'll separate them. Erase their geography, and memory will often follow. Some were sent to Gazana on the Habra River, others to the cities of the Medes, still others to Calhoun Nimrod, Ada, where they labored in the shadow of winged Lamassu statues that looked nothing like Yahweh. There, in those alien lands, the Israelites began their afterlife of survival, not of body, but of identity. But it was never whole. The disassembly of a people, what happens to a community when its genealogies are lost? In Israel, tribal identity was everything. You were a Levite, or you were not. You could offer sacrifice, or you could not. Marriage, land, inheritance. Even prayer, they all depended on your name and the names of your fathers. But in exile, there were no land records, no priests recognized by a unified temple, no elders to verify lineage. Families, once sure of their bloodline back to Jacob, were now guessing. A man in Media might claim descent from Asher. His cousin in Haran might say Naphtali, but no written record would survive to settle the matter. Even the language began to warp. Children learned to speak Akkadian to survive. They prayed in whispers, using phrases that no longer matched the psalms they half remembered, and in time, their gods began to blend with those of their neighbors, not through conversion at first, but through confusion. Was Yahweh the same as Ashur, only with different names? Was the Sabbath meant to fall on the same day in this new place? Was it even safe to remember? And so, piece by piece, the tribes unraveled. Coins with no temple watt. Use is gold when there's no altar. A few sacred objects may have been smuggled out by fleeing priest-lamps' censors. Oil vessels, symbols of a ritual that no longer had a space to live. But in exile, there was no tabernacle, no ark, no temple, and so these objects became private talismans, often misunderstood by those who found them. There are accounts buried in obscure Babylonian tax documents of foreigners paying bribes in odd-shaped weights, small, golden, lions, almond-shaped discs etched with unreadable marks, tiny bells of beaten gold. To the Assyrians, they were simply curious coins, but to their owners, they may have been more an inheritance, a prayer, a piece of a vanished world, and, like all currencies, they lost value when no one could remember the meaning behind their form. The ghost tribes, by the 6th century BCE, the 10 tribes had not returned, nor had they revolted. They were not like Judah, who tried to throw off Babylon and paid dearly for it. The 10 tribes simply disappeared. They became what scholars now call ghost tribes, names without bodies, but not entirely in the ruins of Nippur. A clay tablet lists names of debtors, among them Yazani, son of Deviah, Hebrew of Bit-Cumri. Bit-Cumri, house of Omri, was the Assyrian name for the northern kingdom of Israel. So here, in exile, someone still carried the echo of a homeland. His name had Hebrew roots. His father's name meant good, as Yahweh read. He borrowed silver, perhaps to buy a goat, or perhaps to pay a bride price. We'll never know, but he existed, not as a warrior, not as a priest, as a man in debt, and that is its own kind of survival, the wandering identity centuries later. As new empires rose and fell, the legend of the 10 lost tribes became something more than history. It became prophecy, promise of return, a mystery that grew because the facts had been erased from India to Ethiopia. Stories emerged of strange tribes that kept Sabbath, avoided pork, and buried their dead in ancient ways. Were they remnants of Israel? In the 8th century CE, Jewish travelers wrote of Jewish warriors in Persia who claimed descent from Dan. In the 12th century, a man named Eldad the Danite wandered into Cairo, claiming to be from a Hebrew kingdom beyond the rivers of Cush. He brought no gold, only stories, and the stories had value because they gave meaning to the absence. They filled the silence left by missing scrolls, melted goblets, and burned villages. They were the afterlife of identity, whispered from father to son, like embers too faint to light a fire, but too sacred to let die the coins buried with them. Dedin, a cemetery near modern-day Mosul. Archaeologists found a set of bronze amulets buried beside 3 skeletons, 2 adults and a child. Each amulet bore a simple glyph, a stylized almond tree, common in Israelite iconography, etched beside a crescent moon Assyrian. One of them contained a tiny sliver of gold foil wrapped around what looked like a lock of hair. Was it a ritual token, protective charm, a final keepsake? We don't know, but it reminds us that even in captivity, even after the gold was taken, some things were hidden inside the body, near the heart, beneath the ribs. Things too precious to trade, too sacred to display, too fragile to explain. The gold that will never be found. Not all gold is made of metal. Some is stored in memory, in the name of a grandmother who once lit a lamp a certain way, in the song a father sang on the day of rest, in the way a community refused to eat certain foods, even though the empire fed them freely. These were not coins. They were rituals, hidden from taxation, immune to inventory. They could not be smelted, but they could be lost. And so, the quietest tragedy of the lost tribes was not their slavery, or even their disappearance. It was the unmeasured gold they carried, the kind no archaeologist will ever find, the kind no emperor could ever spend, the kind that dies only when forgotten. A final thought as you drift tonight. Let this question settle somewhere deep within. Is it better to leave behind gold or memory? Which one outlasts the empire? And if a people vanishes, but a single coin with their blessing remains buried under centuries of stone. ... Is that loss? Or is it something more mysterious? A sign, not of what was forgotten, but of what someone, somewhere, still remembered. The gold of the 10 tribes did not return. A caravan came home to Samaria. No procession bore the temple treasures back across the desert. But their absence never stayed silent. In every generation, someone searched, not just for wealth, but for proof that the story had not ended. This final section explores those searches, the quiet obsession with locating the lost tribes, the myths that filled their absence, the foreign lands that welcomed imagined Israelites, and the modern sciences that tried to make sense of an ancient disappearance. This is the archaeology of yearning. Myth. As a map, the farther the 10 tribes faded into the past, the larger they grew in legend. By the Middle Ages, European Jews and Christian scholars alike were whispering of distant lands where Hebrew kingdoms still thrived, untouched by Babylon, Rome, or even time itself. Eldad Hadani, the mysterious 9th century traveler, claimed that for tribes Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher had never been exiled. Instead, they had migrated to an unknown land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. There, they lived freely, governed by their own laws, speaking pure Hebrew. He spoke of warriors who could kill lions with their bare hands, of judges who lived 120 years, and of gold coins engraved with the name of God, used only within their tribe. No one could verify Eldad's claims, but no one could refute them either. In a world still shadowed by empire and war, the idea of a free Jewish kingdom, wealthy, pure, and hidden, was too powerful to ignore. Eldad's stories were copied, translated, passed from rabbi to priest to explorer. For some, they were hope. For others, justification for conquest. And so, the myth became a compass. The colonial recasting when European powers began expanding into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They often encountered indigenous peoples with unfamiliar customs, some of whom perhaps accidentally resembled faint echoes of ancient Israelite law. Among the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, Christian missionaries found communities who observed dietary restrictions, lit candles on Fridays, practiced ritual purification, and claimed descent from the tribe of Dan. Instead of asking how those practices evolved, many simply assumed they must be the lost tribes. Similar claims were made of the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, of the Kaifeng Jews in China, and later most famously of Native American tribes. In 1650, English theologian Thomas Thurgood published Jews in America, arguing that the indigenous peoples of the New World were in fact Israelites who had sailed across centuries before. This was not mere curiosity. It became part of the theological scaffolding that justified colonialism. If the tribes were already there, the land was not truly new. If the people were Israelites, their discovery was a return, not a theft. In this way, the gold of the 10 tribes, the symbolic treasure of lineage, of divine promise, was once again traded. This time, not for bread, but for ideology. Paper. Treasure's not all treasure is metal. Between the 12th and 17th centuries, Jewish scholars across Europe and North Africa began compiling letters, scrolls, genealogies purporting to connect themselves to one of the lost tribes. These were not forgeries. They were attempts to map identity onto absence. A letter from the Jewish community of Yemen, for example, declared their descent from Reuben. A Moroccan chronicle traced local families to Issachar. The Bene Israel of India told a story of 7 men washed ashore centuries earlier, survivors of a ship fleeing Assyrian captivity. None could be verified. But that was not the point. These papers were portable temples. They replaced land with legend. In exile, such legends served as passports to hope, and sometimes they offered real protection. In 15th century Portugal, when forced conversions spread through the Jewish population, one family claimed direct descent from Zebulun and cited an ancient charter from an earlier king, allegedly granting them special immunity. Whether real or fabricated, it gave them just enough leverage to flee before the Inquisition tightened its grip, even in silence. The lost tribes spoke not as fact, but as narrative armor, the science of yearning in the 20th and 21st centuries. The story took on a new dimension, genetics, with the advent of DNA analysis. Researchers began testing the claims that had for centuries lived only in myth and manuscript. Among the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, certain genetic markers were found too, align loosely with Semitic ancestry, though not definitively Israelite. Among the Limba of Zimbabwe, priestly subgroup showed striking similarity to the Cohen model haplotype, a genetic pattern shared by many Jewish males claiming priestly descent. And yet, even these discoveries failed to solve the mystery. Instead, they complicated it. Was identity a strand of DNA, a tradition, a memory? Could a people lost by empire be restored by algorithm? As science pressed deeper into genomes, many communities resisted. They argued that faith and memory, not test results, grieved the tribe's dot in this way. The gold of the lost tribes, the metaphoric treasure, remained untouched by machinery. You can count base pairs. You cannot weigh longing. The treasury of silence, what remained then, was not gold, but a silence shaped like a people. Archaeologists never found the carts that left Samaria. No hordes of Israelite treasure turned up in Assyria or Babylon or even the Medes. But in 1993, at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel, a broken basalt stele was found. Its Aramaic inscription referred to the house of David, the earliest non-biblical reference to King David ever discovered. It was not gold, but it was proof, a splinter of history that sharpened memory into something more solid. Might such a stone exist for the 10 tribes? Perhaps not. Perhaps their greatest artifact is the space they left behind, the space that every generation has tried, some way, to fill, through scrolls, through fables, through science. through silence, through the stubborn refusal to forget. A quiet ending that isn't tanned. So, after 2,700 years, the 10 tribes remain missing. Their gold is still gone. Their names live on only in liturgy, old maps, and whispered bedtime stories.